minutes from last month, and we need a motion and a second, and then we can have some discussion.
I'll make a motion.
Okay? So Teresa Barnett and Claudia Linhoff is our second. Is there any discussion about the minutes, any additions or corrections? Okay. Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Opposed, same sign. The motion passes. So the next thing that's on our agenda is adoption of rules of order for the task force. We need to figure out how we want to be governed. There was some discussion about, should it be majority rule? Should it take a supermajority? Will there be a minority report? Those kinds of items. So I want to open that up for discussion by the body. Anybody have any feelings one way or another? Ms. Ammons. Yeah, you push that button.
I haven't used this room in a long time.
You and me
Good
both.
morning. Just one item under that list that we talked about at a time. I think at this point I'll make a motion that we utilize Robert rules to govern the structure of the meeting, since we do that. So that's my motion.
Okay, is there a second? Sorry, Siri thinks that we're talking to it. We have a motion and a second for Robert's Rules of Order. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. The motion passes, so we will be governed by Robert's rules. Do we want to have any discussion about whether or not there will be, in the committee reports and the final report, if there will be a minority report as well, or do we want, go ahead.
I was going to, I think there should be space for a minority report, in the sense of, if the task force is unable to meet all of the areas of the legislative initiative, that we identify, even in that minority report, things that we just couldn't complete, and things that come up that may not have adequate time, even if with an extension, to produce.
Okay. So does anybody else, any other discussion about that issue? So do we need a formal motion, or do we just have consensus that as we write the report, we will allow space for a minority report? I think everybody's kind of nodding their head yes. So we will do that, and we probably, as we get closer to the report writing, we'll have more discussion about the structure and how that's all going to work anyway. The next item on our agenda relates to subcommittees, and I think there was a suggestion at the last meeting that we look at the statutory areas that we were required to address and try to break down subcommittees that way. And it, in some ways, actually dovetails with the item that's marked draft for discussion that you all have in your packet, where our staff did a great job of trying to take our areas that we listed as areas of interest and break them down under each of the statutory requirements that we need to fulfill. So I'd like to open the floor then to discussion about, well, maybe first, is there a motion to adopt subcommittees based on?
I have a comment before,
Sure.
if I could, or
Of course. Sure.
I just wondered, when we talked about that last meeting, the subcommittee concept, we did that at the very beginning. And, myself, looks like a very good idea. And then I'm glad you touched this, because when we got done and had those 12 items, we had quite a laundry list there, for lack of a better word. I think this draft discussion we all got them fit in there real good, and I was glad to see that. But I'm also wondering, I know myself serve on this task force, and I asked this question of the others.
Hi, Donovan Griffith of the Illinois Manufacturers Association. I would echo Steve's comments and concerns and would go ahead and second that motion. I think, as a lot of us here on the task force would probably agree, every one of these issue areas interest us. And I, for one, would not want to be excluded from any of the subgroups. That said, I also think when looking at the issues of the subgroups, I think that they don't stand alone. I don't know how we move forward with one without the other being involved. For example, the first one, I don't know how the group developing the state plan can be separate from, say, the group establishing the legislative recommendations. So just to echo Steve's comments, I have those concerns as well and would second his motion.
So I guess I wouldn't anticipate that the creation of subcommittees would prohibit any member from attending a subcommittee meeting that either they weren't assigned to or that, I guess, that they were assigned to. The goal was simply to have a workable number of people in the room to get some work done. I'm happy to do it either way, but the reality is there isn't legislation yet to extend our deadline. We have a June deadline. We have a lot of work to do and not a whole lot of time. If everybody wants to meet more frequently than once a month and do these things, I think we could do that. But I think there has to be a commitment from the body to, if we're gonna not have subcommittees, to work through each of these areas, and it's probably more than one meeting on each of these areas.
But weren't we, okay, if we went the subcommittee route, and I'm posing this question, with the duties and responsibilities kind of assigned to different members who are volunteering for that, that's going to also take another meeting also.
Mhm.
So, and I want to stress, I'm not being critical of A, B, C, and D. I think that's the way to go, and I think this draft discussion, the way it's put in here, is excellent and a good starting point here. I'm just concerned with having full involvement and making sure everybody understands what's going on.
Of course.
Understand it, you gotta be involved.
Senator Bennett.
We're all in the wording process here, I know I am.
Senator Bennett.
No, I appreciate that, Steve. I just wanted to, we've got two different deadlines kind of thrown around. Just want to give an update on that. Representative Ammons and Senator Rose and myself have a bill which is supposed to be for committee this week that would extend our deadline till December. So again, it hasn't passed yet. I can understand if you want to take a conservative approach and assume, the deadline that we currently have in place, but I'm pretty optimistic about its passage that would give us an extra 6 months for the findings. I think that was one of the more obvious things that came out of our first meeting, so I want to give it more time.
Great. Representative Allen.
I just wanted to suggest on the subcommittee formation, I sit on a few task forces as well. It is, in many cases for a task force, certainly of this size, it is quite unwielding to do the roll up your sleeve concept in this process, which probably won't happen at any single meeting that we attend. Because these are all, I agree with you, very heavy topics, the subcommittee structure does not preclude any member who wants to be on every single one of them from doing so, because it's just the way the structure is. But to think that we are going to be able to, even extending to December, mind you, of course, we have a heavy legislative schedule. We have, and you all have all of your own municipal or village schedules that you're following too. It will be a very long meeting to get to all of these things under that without a subcommittee structure. I just cannot see how we will even be able to do it. Even with today's meeting, we have a presentation we'll sit through that won't allow us to tease out any actual recommendations until we go back in a small group to have some discussion. So I'm a proponent of the small group, even though I may want to be on all of these. I know realistically to produce something even by December in that full committee or commission structure is going to be very difficult for us to do. And lean, meaning we will have to lean heavily on staff, in this case IEPA and maybe the Research Institute, to even produce any of these things out of here. So I think the subcommittee structure will allow us to get further down the road.
One thing I might just say that, do you agree that when you look at A, B, C, and D, they are
that's my main concern too. I don't know how the subcommittee for D can move forward legislative recommendations without first hearing from and having a completed subcommittee or completed conversation on identifying the actions that might take to ensure long-term protection. I would think that the legislation would come out of those discussions, and I don't know how those two things can operate separate from each other.
If I can just say, the subcommittee structure, the requirement of the structure itself is to bring back to the full body, like any other subcommittee structure, the recommendations, reported research from those subcommittees, so that we can put it all together and make a recommendation ultimately. I just don't see how workable it will be in this format for us to actually deal with all this, even extending to December. I don't see that as a realistic framework of work and structure.
Teresa, did you have a comment?
Yes. I was just going to say that I am in support of the subcommittees because I do think that the magnitude of the work and the research that we need to do. So my question would be, I mean, because we would all be willing and need to bring our reports and our work back to this larger group, does that satisfy the need for conversation, for input from all of us, for further questioning or direction that you would like a certain subcommittee to take? Because I agree, I don't see how we can do this as a huge body. I think there have to be smaller bodies that do a lot of the work and bring it back to the task force. Thank you.
I would actually still have an issue with that because you still have these subcommittees bringing to a large group conversations that they've had, not privy to the other conversations in the other subgroups. So you're still having people come and present to the entire group on legislative recommendations without possibly hearing from the other groups or taking part in those conversations. So I would have an issue with a subcommittee presenting information on legislative recommendations without first participating in these other groups.
Well, and maybe not that one, but the rest of them where we are identifying and we're looking at actions and we're looking at all of those things. Can you see that those other three could work in a subcommittee to come back? I mean, I agree we should all be part of the legislative recommendations. I agree 100% on that. It's just how do we get there and get through?
Go ahead.
I'm torn. In one sense, it's 6 of one and a half a dozen of the other, because I suspect that if we were to do a subcommittee organization, that the vast majority of unique interests would want to participate in all of those subcommittees. So, I don't have a strong feeling one way or the other, but I think we should probably recognize that however we decide to go about it, we're the same folks, again, who are, well, maybe all of us, quite frankly. I mean, I would suspect everybody around the table has an interest in all 4 of these things, which is why we're here today. So we could divide it up by subcommittee, but we're going to see the same smiling faces whenever we have those subcommittees. So, again, I'm torn because, there is a lot of work to do by December, presuming that. I think that's safe. I would concur that, this is as much of a no-brainer as it comes to when it comes to a legislative proposal to extend the deadline. And so if we were to have 4 subcommittee meetings plus the task force meeting, we've just multiplied by 5 all the meetings that I suspect everybody here is going to want to attend, or most everybody. So it's a difficult situation, I understand. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sure. I'm going to Senator Rose, and then I'll come back to you.
It's okay. A couple things. First of all, I appreciate Representative Ammons and Senator Bennett's help to get this extended. I share their enthusiasm that it will get extended, so I'm not worried at all about that. I think you'd extend this to the moon, and without subcommittees, we're not going to get anything done. You're not going to get this many people to cover this much ground and effectively. So, and moreover, at least the recommendations I made to the governor a lot of them were made on people's, specific skill sets. For example, Teresa being an emergency management person, my thought is she's the perfect person to be in the subcommittee dealing with, actions for long-term protection and the emergency management piece of that, which, by the way, while I'm on that, I would note that there needs to be more than emergency action plans for gas storage fields. It should be emergency action plans in general, was sort of its own theme. But I think Donovan makes a good point that D should not be a subcommittee of its own, all on its own. The recommendation should be from the full task force. So I would suggest that we move those three sub bullets into one of the top three, probably B. D, 3 bullets go to B, because that's all kind of in that sort of vein. But I just don't know, and I thought we kind of concluded that this is the way we're going to go at the last meeting, because I don't think we're anything, if the goal is to get something done, I don't know how we're going to cover this much ground between now and December as a full group. I think you're going to have to subcommittee it.
Mayor, you had something?
Well, he stole one of my points there when that was on D, whether that needed to be a subcommittee or not. The other was just if we do go with the subcommittees, and maybe it's just me that's confused, there seemed to be a lot of duplication between the subcommittees. And so from a time standpoint, I'm just wondering who's going to duplicate all of the science and the facts to 3 different subcommittees that are going to be happening at the same time? Because that will pull on the same resources is what I'm afraid of.
Go ahead, Jeff, sure. I'm sorry, Representative Ammons.
So I do agree with your analysis on how the bullet points are categorized, which I think is a somewhat another discussion that we should have about what the categories should be. But for this point here, if we could figure out, Mayor Finan, how to simply take a pulse of subcommittees, and then we can figure out what should be under the subcommittees, or what we
Right,
should
so
study.
the item 4 on the
Yeah.
agenda is looking at
At what should be under there.
which
Yeah.
should be under. And even if we don't go to subcommittees, I think we still want to categorize items based on our statutory marching orders, basically, so that we can get some work done, would be my suggestion. So if there's no more discussion about subcommittees, I think the motion
more.
was to not, yep.
So with subcommittees, the group will still come back, and I would expect that there'd be 2 or 3 meetings of the full body that would pull all of that together.
And I assume that subcommittees, because they will be governed by the Open Meetings Act, will take minutes and record their meetings. And so even if you're not present, the information would be available.
My experience with subcommittees is that you can dig deeper into the issues, which is what we're here to do. And if they're pulled together at the end with the body, that's a good move for us and the public. So,
Yes, go ahead.
I'd like to ask if we think we have logistical support for that additional number of meetings. It takes time to arrange for these venues and people's commitment of time and so on, and I'd just like to make sure before we, at least before we make a collective decision, that we understand whether or not we have the resources to efficiently make use of those additional meetings and to organize them.
Director, do you want to speak to that?
Rats, I thought he was going to answer the question for me. Well, do you have some thoughts? No? Oh, darn, okay. No, okay. No, it will be a challenge, but we'll soldier through with whatever the will of the group is. Again, well, as I said, I could see it going either way. I don't have a strong feeling. It's a lot of information for us to digest and turn around, given that there might be 3 different subcommittees plus whatever we're doing here, further given the overlap. We'll make it work. Boy, I think it took me 3 minutes to finally get to that point.
When I got the agenda and I looked at the subcommittees, I thought that we would go ahead and proceed that way with subcommittees. I didn't realize there was a potential for bringing them all together and meeting on each one of them. As you said in our last meeting, there are a multitude of issues here. Trying to bring this vast group together on every one of those issues, I would agree with Mr. Rose and Carol that it'd be very difficult. So I took myself and my own special interest, like you said, even though I find them all interesting, and I said, okay, how would I rate myself? Because I thought you might say, okay, who wants to be on what subcommittee? So if you want to be on all of them, that's great. Why bring all people together for somebody that wants to be on all of them anyway? If we all did, we wouldn't be talking about this. So I rated where I'd want to be on each one of those subcommittees. Do I want to be on C and D, and then maybe E, and see how many people are there? I didn't know how that would work. So I'd like to know, if we do vote on subcommittees, how people are going to be chosen to be on them.
Well, that's one of the
Part of
items.
the next item.
Yeah, and
Yes.
so I think,
Before I vote,
I
though,
assumed that
I wondered or
people,
not.
and we can do it however we want, so it'd be the will of the task force, but I assume that people would generally self-identify and choose the areas that they were most interested in. It would be nice to have a mix of, technical and politicians, so that we don't have one more heavy than the other on each of these areas. But there would be nothing precluding any member from attending any of the meetings. We would need, chairs for each of the subcommittees just to make sure meetings get scheduled and work gets done. But beyond that, I think any member could attend any of them.
It might be interesting just to do an informal show of hands of which folks on the task force would be attending all of the subcommittees. That's fine.
So-
might
So
address some of those
who thinks that they would
issues.
go to every single subcommittee meeting?
Fantastic. Solves
About
that problem.
half?
Okay.
Okay. And George, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I think also, similar to point B, point A, developing the statewide plan kind of has to come afterwards. So I guess my suggestion would be to rearrange all the bullets under B and C and do those 2 subcommittees, make one technical, make the second one more regulatory legal, because both of those kind of need to be fleshed out, and then go to A and D.
So are you advocating for subcommittees, or just that's the order of the work that we do?
Well, I'm advocating for 2 subcommittees, one on B and one on C, that sort of cover a lot of those bullets, and then we move to A and D
Okay.
after those subcommittees.
So
One more
do
technical,
the
one
work
more
of B
legal.
and C and then reconvene. How are people feeling about that idea? Okay. All right. So would people be comfortable breaking up into subcommittees for BNC? Yeah, go ahead.
Oh,
Either way.
Sorry, just, and again, any member then that's part of this body can be, I don't know if there'd be voting done in the subcommittee, but would be just as active a member in the subcommittee
Yes.
as anyone.
Right, I think it's just an opportunity to try to get a smaller group of people who can have more engaged conversations on particular topic areas. I guess I see the task force meetings as kind of these types of things right now. We're doing the organizing and sort of the overarching stuff, but it's hard to get into the meat of each of these issues. And I would like to set up a structure where we are primarily working on the issues before us rather than the structure of the committee. Yep. Alec?
Agree, I think at our last meeting, that we could utilize telecommunication and things like that for some of these discussions. Might make it a little bit less of a burden for people who are nervous about it. Yeah.
Right. So right now, what the motion that's on the floor is to not have any subcommittees. That'd be great. Sure.
Not to adopt the subcommittee structure and have a full task force engage and work with all statutory responsibilities, because that's what A, B, C, and D came back to.
Okay. So all those in favor of the motion that's on the floor signify by, and actually, I think we need a show of hands. Yeah, it did have a second. Yep. Donovan. We need a show of hands because I'm guessing it's going to be hard to tell by a nay and yay. So all those in favor signify by raising your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, and so that motion fails. So do we have a motion to, I guess, do the George suggestion, which is, okay, there you go. The George plan.
I would move to adopt the RoadCap plan, which would create 2 subcommittees. The first identifying the contamination threats to the water quality of the aquifer. Second, to identify actions to ensure the long-term protection, listed as B and C as under the draft for discussion.
Okay, so we have a motion and a second. Do we have any discussion on that item? So all those do you want to discuss? Go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm just wondering, I worry that some of these issues, like the individual bullet points that are sort of their own thing, they've fallen under one of these categories, but they could totally be studied on their own. I don't want those issues that we could make good progress on to sort of fall by the wayside. So will these subgroups have a way of, making sure that we have people working on, I guess I'm proposing subgroups, but, it just like, if we go too broad, we'll never make progress on individual items. And then the second point would be, when do we transition from subgroups that focus on B and C to subgroups that focus on A and D? And do we want to have a plan up front that says when we start looking at the legislative and options, or no?
At this point, I'm considering changing the legislation to change the date to creating a new task force to decide about subcommittees. Because this is an issue that we need to discuss more. What I would propose is to use the original date, which is June 1st, as the stage 1, which is examining those 2 issues. And then we could use the time after June 1 to both develop the state plan, which I think will take quite a bit of work, and the legislative proposals. That would be my suggestion, is 3 or 4, and if we go 1 extra month, if we need that for the subcommittees, no harm done. We still have 5 months to really kind of work together as a group to develop a comprehensive state plan, or to divide into whatever subgroups we think are necessary at that point. That'd be my suggestion.
Representative Van.
Thank you. I support the B and C recommendation. Just wanted to highlight that in items A, as we talked earlier about the subcommittee structure, the first and the third bullet point actually should be under B anyway, right? So some of this needs to be consolidated, and I would hope that as we build out the 2 committees, which I'm supportive of 2 of them, that the staff includes for us those bullet points that commonly make sense under B and C, so that we can get to as much as we can under the first phase. And then when we get to second phase, public education under A would go down with D, right? So some of these need to be just simply rearranged so they fit in here the way that we want to, and we don't necessarily lose bullet points, we just want to move them around.
Yes.
And I'm sorry, and under this plan, we do B and C, then with A and D, the plan and legislation, are those done in subgroups as well, or are those, do you plan on doing those as a group as a whole?
I think we could decide that at that point, once the initial.
Because I would just like to stress, and I think Senator Rose brought this up, that any legislative recommendations should not be done in a subgroup, but should be done as a committee as a whole.
And I think those would probably be easier gotten to if we have the information from BNC. Then we're kind of all starting from that same technical information and could work on legislative. Senator Rose?
When we originally discussed this, it was, to your point, Andrew, more than, a couple things. It was some topic-specific things where you could take a pretty deep dive. I have no objection to the road cap plan as stated. However, I do think that the emergency action response issue is its own subcategory, and we've got a pretty significant issue already ongoing. And I think it, on behalf of my constituents, I think it deserves its own attention as a subcategory, as a subgroup. But if you look at just within the Oil and Gas Act, as I have in the last 3 months, oil is treated differently than natural gas is treated. And in terms of notification, for example, after there's an incident. So, I would almost say that we should have, and I can't amend a motion on the table, but that's a hopeful way of saying perhaps Mr. Rocap would amend his own motion into BC and then sort of emergency response or emergency action plan or some other third category that would take a deep dive into those items, because what's happening right now in Southwest Champaign County is unacceptable, and I think it deserves its own attention.
I'd actually like to give this task force some credit in that as we kind of go through these discussions, I assume that you're right. We're going to spend a fair amount of time just on that. Like a lot of these bullets and sub-bullets, I have faith that we'll be able to identify those things that we spend a relatively modest amount of time on, and other topics such as that one that we'll spend more significant amount of time on. So and I think that the decisions we might want to make today may change after we have the benefit of having discussion from the Institute and agency staff and other stakeholders that have a lot of important perspectives to provide. So I imagine that we will spend a large amount of time on that. It's important, I concur. But maybe we can kind of get the ball rolling on these general topics and then evolve as we move forward and as we figure out what needs more precise attention.
I appreciate Senator Rose highlighting that, and I'm doing this little arrow thing on my paper because I certainly see the Mahomet current issue as relevant to identifying potential and current contamination threats, right, under B. So I think if staff would take a stab at it and send it to us electronically, we can look at the rearrangement of these bullet points to make sure we're covering them. And I agree that the legislative steps can be a full committee, a full commission action, but the other three, including Mahomet, should be into the first, I think it should be in the first part of the discussion because it is current. And it also doesn't preclude this commission from meeting in Mahomet and making ourselves available to the impacted area and community. So I think that is an important part of us.
So you'd rather put it in B
dive.
because
Yeah.
emergency action plans is already in C and in what was D.
Yeah, so they can move it. I just think it should be included on the front part of the two committees, right? It should be on the front part as we rearrange these bullet points to make sure we're covering as much as we can before we get to stage 2, which is going to be full commission, looking at recommendations, looking at what we've learned and things of that nature. So I think it should be included earlier.
Okay, so
So
I
can I
think
ask
we're kind of mixing agenda items. We have an agenda item to just, if we want to rearrange bullet points or discuss bullet points. At this point, I think we need to figure out, are we going to have subcommittees or not? And then we can, talk about the tasks of those subcommittees. George, were you going to amend your road cap plan?
Yes, I was going to amend it to have
Actually, it was
a third
Scott's.
subcommittee to deal with the natural gas issues. So lump those, is that what you wanted?
It's been,
It's my motion, so I suppose I should amend it. I would assume that once a subcommittee is created, the chair of that committee and the members can divide it into any subcommittees they want, as long as they're completed by the completion date we agree on. So if they, I think these are kind of advisory, what we imagine some of the items would be, but if you find something from your research that you want to go a different direction and add something else, I think that's the purview of that committee, of that subcommittee. Because of staffing and other thing, I'm not going to amend my motion to add additional committees. I think it was good to get it down to 2, because I think that could be more than, especially if we're planning on attending as many meetings as we had at least suggested. So I guess if I could amend my motion, I'm thinking now about where the timetable should be. I said June 1st. Frankly, I think the heavier lift will be in the subcommittee phase and not the state plan. So if I can amend the motion, it would be the same as I said before with the 2 committee structures. And again, we'll, I think, address what's going to be under each subcommittee as we go forward, with a proposed completion date of those subcommittees by, I would say, September 1st.
Okay, anyone?
By September 1st, and that would leave 3 months for the complete group to come up with a state plan.
So in our August meeting, we would expect subcommittees reporting out to the task force.
That would be the intent of that motion, yes.
Okay. I see. Everybody's kind of nodding. Who is your second for that?
I'm happy to say,
Okay.
Representative Ayon, sorry.
So we have a motion and a second with the motion as revised. Is anybody have further discussion about the breaking down into the 2 subcommittees? Yep.
Just wanted to make sure I understand here, so we're gonna have A stay the way it is and combine B and C, correct?
No.
Correct, and then D will stay as,
No, that's not right. No.
I'm sorry, B and C.
B and C are standalone.
Mayor Marlin.
Just a comment and a question. I support the 2 subcommittees as proposed. My question is, who is the lead logistical support for this in terms of when these subcommittees are reporting out information, who's compiling everything that's coming out as we go along? I'm looking over there, but I'm not sure if I should be.
No, I think that's the correct direction to look in.
Okay.
Right, the agency. I think that's what our anticipated.
Okay,
That's where
thank
we'll
you.
go.
Okay, so all those in favor of the road cap plan as amended, please signify by raising your hand. Okay, so that motion passes. And I don't know if we need an exact count for the minutes, but, okay, so do we have anybody vote no? All right, so everybody is a yes, other than Senator Rose, who is a no. So we now have two subcommittees that can begin to do some work. I think probably not on here, but the next question is, do we have 2 people willing to chair subcommittees? Because we're going to want them to start working prior to our next meeting. And maybe I'll just kind of leave that for people to think about while we move on. And
Mayor, if
Yes.
I could, I'm just trying to think of the order. Would it make more sense to the body to actually decide who goes on what subcommittee, and then that group would then decide the subcommittees? Or
Sure.
how would you prefer to
That's
do it?
fine.
Okay.
I'd also suggest that absent our own rules, Robert's rules controls. And my guess is, without having reviewed it, that you as chair probably appoint the subcommittee chairs, is my guess.
Okay.
So maybe what we want to do is organize the two subcommittees, and then anybody interested, just get it to you, and then administratively, you could make that, selection.
Is everybody comfortable simply reporting to me which subcommittee you want to be on? Or even if you're going to attend both, if you can choose one, and then if everybody chooses the same one, I'll call you each and talk about which one you need to go on, I guess. I think it might be easier to do it that way rather than, have it, hour-long conversation about which subcommittee everybody wants to be on.
And just to be democratic about a small d, if the subcommittee members want to meet and forward a recommendation to you, I don't have an issue with that. I just think that administratively, you should just do that rather than have all of us sit here and try to
That's fine.
figure it out right now.
That's fine. And people maybe want time to think about committees as well.
Is the implication that you said pick one or the other, that we would only be a voting member of one of the two bodies?
I think our discussion was that if you are a committee member and you show up at a meeting, you would have the ability to vote at whatever meeting you are at. But we need a working core of people who are committed to attending subcommittee meetings, who are going to work on that subcommittee and make sure that the work gets done.
Just for today, if I can look again down the row here and suggest that we just simply logistically do a survey monkey, send it out to all the commissioners, ask them to select A or whatever you call in these subcommittees, one or two, or A or B, or whatever you want to call them, so that we can go ahead and get a list and just put a deadline on that for us to respond.
And I assume that your motion included the discussion that everybody, any task force member would be a voting member on any of the subcommittees.
That was my intent. If the governor put you on the board, you're on the board.
So if you want to go to both, you can. And if it looks like, if we continue to have subcommittee meetings that are 20 people, then I guess we can just start meeting as a body. But let's hope that we can get some work done. Okay. So the next item on the agenda is the subcommittee areas of interest. We have the draft for discussion, and then we also have the minutes, which listed each of the items that were the task force developed at the last meeting. There's already been some discussion about ways to revise that. So I will open the floor for additional discussion about moving items around that are on the draft for discussion. Anybody have any other suggestions? Yes, go ahead, Alex.
More of a question. Are we wedded to this list? I mean, are we adding or subtracting potentially? If we decide that we've got more on here, or there's something that we've omitted, is this
I see this as guidance for the subcommittees to get them started. These were the areas that the task force identified at that first meeting. I think there's already been discussion that if the task force hears some technical report and decides, oh gosh, we really need to go in that direction, that they certainly can, and there wouldn't be anything prohibiting them. But I'll go back to, we have a finite amount of time and a million issues we could cover. So at a minimum, I think the idea would be to cover the issues that are listed. And if the task force wants to go broader, and they have time to, they certainly could. And I'm not the arbiter of that. That's just my thoughts. So yeah.
I understand. I think we're coming from the same place. My thinking on this was, as I made my way through the materials and read about the water supply plan already being done pretty recently, we might actually find
which would be great. And the agency did a really nice job of providing all of the research that already exists. So thank you for doing that, because I think that's helpful. So does anybody have any further suggestions about how to move items around?
I don't have any suggestions, but I just want to make sure, so when we remove things around, I just want to make sure I've gotten kind of the will.
Yeah, my only suggestion is that the emergency action plan and the gas storage issues are probably all under one heading instead of two.
Right.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, under C, I think, right, okay. So I'm mumbling, I apologize. So again, just to make sure that I understand what the general discussion has been, so we can reformulate these things and make sure that the Survey Monkey, which is a great suggestion, is accurate. So bullets 1 and 3 under A will move into heading B. And the second bullet under D moves into C.
I don't think it matters, other than the fact that potential and current is the sub B, potential and current threats. So it's sort of a current threat, I mean, just to be intellectually consistent. Yeah, although I don't, I as long as it gets covered, I don't really care, but.
Okay.
Well, for just putting it together with the other gas storage field piece, we can put it in C, but I agree with you, actually, that's, yeah. But, so those are the changes I think that we'll make, and then the public education piece, which is not being moved, we'll put that towards the end, along with the other legislative recommendation components that are left. Am I missing anything that anyone felt strongly or lukewarm about?
Under B, I would put the second bullet of groundwater restriction ordinances into C. And then under C, put the first bullet into B, the recharge. And then under D, I would put the first bullet into B. And the third bullet into C as well.
Those restriction ordinances, though, are where you're leaving the contamination in place. So that might be a
Oh, okay, if you want to
contamination
clarify
threat.
that.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Right. And George, you said, what was the second piece? You mentioned the first bullet in C. Was that correct?
Yeah,
I was thinking about the first one. I'm sorry.
I moved that to B, as well as the first bullet in D. Just move that to B.
I think I got everything.
Okay, and
Would you mind reviewing everything?
We can have a subcommittee on the review. Yeah, right.
So we have consensus on that. I don't think we need to vote on it. Again, the subcommittees can add or subtract as they go, but this at least gives them some areas to begin to focus on.
I just didn't keep track of all the changes they were doing. I don't know, Alec, if you could just review where you were moving everything.
One more time, sure. Yep, absolutely. So, bullets 1 and 3 will move into subgroup B. And then the public education component that is untouched, we'll move that down towards the end, along with the legislative recommendations, since the state plan and the legislative recommendations will all be discussed by the task force in whole. And then the first bullet in C, we're going to move into B. And then the second bullet in D will be moved into C.
And what about the third bullet in D?
Third bullet in D. Those may be recommendations.
That's more of a policy, I mean, it doesn't need any studying.
Well, I think, I don't have a strong feeling, but I suspect that one of the things that we talked about based on the first task force meeting is that we would anticipate some changes being made. There might be some legislative recommendations there. But again, I mean, I think that's one of those things that will probably evolve as we kind of go through things. I don't have a strong feeling, though.
Yes.
Just to point out, we made a motion to go down to 2 subcommittees, and then we just basically put everything in those 2 subcommittees. So it'd be a surprise to me that this entire body doesn't partake in both those subcommittees at this point.
Yes.
We
Representative
actually
Hammond.
only made 2 subcommittees, and we still have a third, which will be the full commission, which is the legislative action, the education, and all of those. So it will still serve its original purpose. I just think that at this point, I think you have the gist of this. When you send it out and allow us to choose 1 or 2 of the subcommittees, or both, which is those who can, just put a little bullet called other. And other will let you do whatever else your subcommittee think you should do once you guys convene.
If
Sounds
you
like a great
could
idea.
include in your Survey Monkey just a spot where people can check if they're interested in sharing the committee as well.
Great idea.
Andrew, did you have another comment?
Yeah, so to be clear, like, I feel like we're talking about things in terms of B and C and not saying what they are. So the division of the 2 subcommittees is present versus long-term planning. Is that sort of the world we're in? And then I would want to make sure that we're all going to be learning a lot, and new issues will come up, and perhaps priority new issues will come up. They need to be able to fall into one of those 2, because there's not I don't want an issue to just not fit because it doesn't fall under short or long-term, whatever. So we're going to need to be flexible in how we identify issues in these subgroups, but at the same time, it only makes sense to have a subgroup if they're distinctly different from each other. So we do need to really think about, I guess, long-term, short-term are the lines we're drawing, and let's try to stick to that on some level.
All of this will evolve over time, and the discussion that we have in all of these subcommittees and the task force will maybe make us add other items, which is why it's good to have that catch-all other. I suspect we'll figure it out as we go. And if we identify other things that need to be talked about, then we're absolutely, all of us are going to talk about it.
Senator?
Just 2 points. One is, again, administratively, I think our chairwoman could assign, new items to various subcommittees just to avoid overlap. But the second point, I'll restate what I said at the meeting, our last meeting, when we picked our great chairwoman. I don't think a legislator should be a chair or a subcommittee chair. I think this should be citizen-led. And so I haven't spoken to any of my colleagues about this, but as we're trying to decide who's going to be our subcommittee chairs, I would encourage us to be citizens, not legislators. And absolutely no disrespect to Representative Ammons or Senator Bennett, but I said this when we elected Deb Finan. I just feel very strongly this needs to be citizen-led, and so I think our subcommittee chair should also be citizens. And if nobody wants to do it, then I nominate Carol.
And I was going to thank you for that commercial. I have no space really, but I am going to be at as many meetings as I can, certainly, and support citizen-led action here and research-based, right? We have enough technical expertise in this room to get this done without us having to pick up another ball. So I appreciate that, Chapin.
And one final thing, and then we're going to actually get into the meat of this, which is our presentations. But on your Survey Monkey, if you can maybe provide some dates when the agency could provide staffing for subcommittee meetings for at least the first round of subcommittee meetings, so that we don't wait a month to have them start meeting. Thank you. All right, so we have Randy Locke.
Take a
That's fine. That's fine. Yeah, there's a screen there too. I don't know that this one
But
is.
it will be at the end here, and I can certainly provide that. Thank you. So thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about natural gas storage in Illinois. What I'm going to do is just present a little bit more of the information that initially was provided within the introductory guide. This information was put together by the Prairie Research Institute Natural Gas Working Group, and with contributions from the IDNR Office of Oil and Gas Resources Management. I would recommend that as the subcommittees start to get into the meat of some of these issues, that they really reach out to IDNR, Mike Mankowski specifically, because of his knowledge of the regulatory framework within Illinois and the existing structure. And some of this is informed by information from him, but we can also dig a little bit deeper after this if you have some additional questions. During the last meeting, we provided the introductory guide, which was just a basic document about the Mahomet Aquifer and natural gas storage. This presentation goes a little bit more in depth on the natural gas storage side of things. So this information is not in the introductory guide, but the presentation will be put on the task force website. And just for a refresher, our point of contact is Trish Barker, and the website is here. So these materials are also available at that location. A couple of quick facts about natural gas in Illinois. There are no significant existing natural gas deposits within Illinois that are naturally occurring. So because 80% of the homes throughout the U.S. rely on natural gas as a heating source, and because demand varies through time, there's been this large infrastructure that's been put into place to be able to accommodate that varying demand. And in Illinois, we have 18 interstate pipelines and 2 market centers. There are 24 active underground gas storage sites, and most relevant to this group, there's only 1 active storage site within the boundaries of the Mahomet Aquifer as defined. Yes? How many of the other 23 legit aquifers, other aquifers? They are distributed throughout the state, mostly in the southern part of the state. I'll show a map of those and also show which units are used as the reservoirs. Because of this reliance on natural gas and a large amount of natural gas storage, Illinois is the state with the largest amount of natural gas storage capacity and saline formations, and I'll talk a little bit about that terminology in a future slide. And if you want a little bit more about the energy portfolio used in Illinois, there's a website that you can go to from the U.S. Energy Information Association. Current authority for oversight of oil and gas operations falls to 3 different groups. For sites within the state, that is, again, IDNR, OOGRM, and they have the regulatory authority for permitting, drilling, and the operations and plugging of oil and gas production wells. There are also 2 other groups, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, and then PHMSA, Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, that have authority for interstate sites. This is the existing authority, and in development are the Illinois Underground Natural Gas Storage Safety Act, which would then provide some additional ability for IDNR to modify its regulatory program and align that with some of these new federal requirements that are in response to leakage events that have happened within the U.S. Also in development are Senate Bill 3548 and 3549, introduced by Senator Rose to amend the Illinois Oil and Gas Act. This would give IDNR additional ability to respond to releases. There would be a notification component to that, as well as an inspection of all oil and gas wells throughout an annual cycle. That's the regulatory framework, a very basic regulatory framework, but let's look at some of the physical context. Now,
full disclosure, I really don't like this graphic, but it at least can help illustrate some of the subsurface conditions that are being used for storage of natural gas. There are 3 different types of gas storage reservoirs within the U.S., and only 2 of these occur within Illinois. The one on the left, depleted fields, and the one on the right, the depleted aquifers. And I don't like some of the terminology, and I'll go through that as well. Depleted fields are also called oil and gas reservoirs, mature reservoirs, or depleted oil and gas reservoirs. That is, after the oil and gas extraction has happened, then it's a reservoir that can be used for storage of gas, or of gas in this context for natural gas storage. You have a set of wells that go into the subsurface, and then a zone in which the natural gas is injected, and that is a porous and permeable material. Jason, under my chair, there's that little tub that has a couple of rock samples. Could you pass those out? The light-colored sample that's going to go around is an example of the Mount Simon sandstone. Take them out? Yeah, go ahead and take them out. People can look at them. And then the darker sample is an example of shale that would be an impermeable material that would be used as a cap rock. So gas is a buoyant fluid, and as it's injected, it wants to naturally migrate upward. So you have to have some kind of containment mechanism, geologic containment mechanism, a trap within the reservoir or above the reservoir to keep the gas in place. So the Mount Simon or some other oil and gas reservoir could be used in a depleted field, and then a cap rock would be above that to limit the movement of the gas. As I said, we don't have salt formations in Illinois. And the other type is a depleted aquifer, also referred to as saline aquifers. I prefer the term saline reservoir. And the reason I prefer that term is that when you talk about depleted aquifers, that assumes or infers that there's some kind of depletion of the resource. You've pulled water out of it. It's no longer being used for that. In actuality, these types of resources or units are not actually used for potable water resources. They have a very high dissolved mineral content. Seawater is on the order of 35,000 to 40,000 parts per million of dissolved components. These are 4 to 8 times the amount of dissolved materials within the fluid in the pore spaces. So the dissolved solids component within saline reservoirs can be anywhere from 120 to over 200,000 parts per million. So these are not used for potable water resources. The other reason I prefer the use of the term reservoir versus aquifer is in a hydrogeologic context. Aquifer can infer that it's a freshwater drinking source. Now, the oil and gas community uses aquifer throughout. So we have to work with these terms, but that's why we'll often refer to these as saline reservoirs. This is just a map showing the distribution of those different types of reservoirs. Within Illinois, the blue dots are the saline reservoirs. The brown triangles are the depleted reservoirs, oil and gas reservoirs. And in the south-central U.S. is where the saline reservoirs occur. Again, not a type in Illinois. A little closer into Illinois, we have 24 active sites in 24 counties. There are 14 inactive or abandoned sites, and about half of those are saline reservoir type, and about half are oil and gas depleted reservoirs. Almost 1,200 active storage wells, about 500 of those, in addition to that, about 500 of those have been part of oil and gas storage and are now abandoned or plugged. So the largest number of wells are used within the saline reservoir context, almost 70% of those wells. Within all the counties, considering all the counties, the top 5 that have the most wells for oil and gas storage, or gas storage using oil or gas wells, are Kankakee, Champaign, LaSalle, Livingston, and McLean. And of most importance to this group, Champaign and McLean are within the 15-county Mahomet Aquifer planning region. However, the gas wells within McLean County are north of where the Mahomet Aquifer boundary is. So it's really only Champaign that has a significant number of wells within the Mahomet Aquifer boundary. One issue related to natural gas storage is the age of the infrastructure. And what this graphic shows, this is from a federal report I'll mention a little bit more in the next slide. Over the development, or through the development of natural gas storage facilities in the U.S., wells have been constructed all the way from the 1880s up to the present. But the greatest number of wells has been constructed since up to 1970s. Almost 75% of the wells that have been constructed for natural gas storage operations had been constructed in the 1970s or prior, which essentially leads to the concern or the issue to make sure that it's being addressed, and that's well integrity. Because of aging infrastructure, wells are constructed of steel components. Some of the downhole materials are subject to corrosion. You have to have a robust mechanical integrity program in the operation of storage fields. And so this brings up the issue of making sure that those wells do have mechanical integrity and it doesn't produce leakage. Yes?
Were these wells all constructed for natural gas storage, or are they using wells that were made for other?
I don't have the breakout of this particular diagram. It's in the federal report, but I think these are specifically for gas storage. So this just brings up the issue of making sure that well integrity well, it's saying that well integrity is a key issue in reducing the risk for natural gas storage.
Can I ask a quick question?
Mm-hmm.
Right now, who is in charge of well integrity and checking it out for all the wells that we have? Is there an agency that does that, or just let that be, say, people gas?
No, so for sites that are within the state, it's my understanding that it is the IDNR group, Oil and Gas Resource Management Office. And for those sites that have interstate exchange of materials, it would be FERC or PHMSA. Those are the interstate sites, the three groups that I mentioned before. In response to a natural gas leakage issue, yes?
Is People's Gas, is that an intrastate because it only supplies Chicago? Supply Indiana?
I'm actually not sure about how, I think, right, it also has to deal with the transfer of gas coming from a different location. So I'm not sure if that falls under DNR or FERC.
I would bet that virtually every Illinois field is interstate because we don't have any, we don't produce a lot of natural gas and produce no oil without natural gas.
There are 5 oil and gas fields that are solely interstate and that fall under FERC and PHMSA, but there are some that are within intrastate for IDNR. But part of the Underground Natural Gas Storage Act is to help sort out that authority responsibility and management issue. And actually back to your question of who has authority over that field and how often are things happening, one of the outcomes of this federal interagency task force report identified that there was actually a number of issues that are not being addressed at these sites. In Illinois, even though there was a commissioning, essentially permitting at the construction of the wells, and then a permitting at the closure and plugging of the wells, there wasn't an ongoing maintenance requirement or review procedure that was set up. And so some of these new efforts are going to take care of that gap. As I said, this task force, this federal interagency task force, was developed in response to the Aliso Canyon incident. This was an incident that did have fatalities. It was, this group was put together to essentially dig through the details on that particular event, understand what failure mechanisms occurred, and understand what could have been done to prevent it. They have a couple of top-level recommendations. Those are specifically related to that incident, but also apply broadly to the United States and existing oil and gas operations and management or regulatory oversight of those. One of those main things that they suggested are that gas storage operators should baseline the status of their wells. Again, this gets to confirming the mechanical integrity of wells throughout time, not just at the beginning and the end, but all the way throughout the operation of them. Making sure that there are robust risk management plans in place, and that's part of a system of the gas field operation, and that in cases where you have old well designs, that those are phased out for more robust downhole well designs. It also identified that in this case and in other cases, advanced preparation for possible leaks is very important in optimizing any kind of a response to a leak. And so it made some other recommendations related to that. These are just top-level recommendations from this task force. There are some other specific recommendations. These are broken into chapters of some of the specific recommendations. But this one, Chapter 3, which I focused on, is really just dealing with well integrity, ensuring the well integrity, making sure you have a risk management system in place to help manage and mitigate risk, and then also make sure that you have good data gathering systems in place to document integrity of the well and operations. And there were some immediate regulatory actions that were identified, and that has come out as the PHMSA interim final rule, which is now being implemented on the state level. IDNR, the Office of Oil and Gas Resource Management, is split up into 3 different districts. So who's going to go and inspect these wells? This is the group that would do it. They do have some new authority because of an interaction with the ICC and now have review capability over some of the sites that the ICC had overviewed before. But this group issues violations for noncompliance, split into 3 districts with 12 inspectors. In 2017, they conducted 32,000 inspections of oil and gas wells. So this is not a small task. To give you a little bit more of a, I think, closer to accurate picture of what a general subsurface natural gas trap or reservoir looks like, this is just a diagram to show you that in Illinois, a number of the places where natural gas are stored are in the bottom of the stratigraphic sequence. This is the Mount Simon Reservoir, which is the most widely used natural gas storage unit. The Ironton-Galesville, which is another natural gas storage unit. And very minorly the St. Peter Sandstone, only where you have other cap rock. But in between, so here are the reservoirs where the gas could potentially be stored. Again, the most used unit at the bottom here. When these wells are used and inject gas into the reservoir, as you saw with those samples, that light-colored sample is a sandstone, so the gas can actually move through the porous permeable spaces. A reservoir has to be able to accept and release the fluids for it to be a usable reservoir. When gas is injected into the reservoir, because of its buoyancy, it then would accumulate near the top of that reservoir, and the cap rock then helps remove the likelihood of it or reduce the likelihood of it moving upward. So the gas accumulates under the cap rock within the reservoir. Interspersed between these reservoirs are cap rocks, and then for reference, the freshwater aquifers are typically separated by thousands of feet from the reservoirs, and the Mahomet Aquifer would be up here in the unconsolidated materials. The bedrock surface in this diagram is right here, and then all of this is part of the bedrock sequence, and these are the glacial deposits in this example. Directly related to the Mahomet Aquifer, there, as I said, one natural gas storage facility. This is the Manlove facility in northwestern Champaign County. There's another inactive facility. This is Crescent City. As is already obviously is well known by this group, the Manlove gas storage field leak has occurred from one of their production wells, the McCord number 2, which is a well that's about 4,000 feet deep. The leakage was first identified in December of 2016, and that leakage occurred through the steel well casing at a depth of approximately 500 feet. So the release was into the bedrock, and then it migrated upward into the Mahomet Aquifer materials, the glacial materials. This was reported to the Illinois Emergency Management Agency, and subsequently, groundwater sampling identified that the gas in some of those wells was thermogenic in origin. That is, it was gas that was produced by a process by the burial of organic material and the thermal alteration of organic material. That type of gas, when you look at it in a chemical compositional analysis, falls into this region. There are other types of naturally occurring gas within the subsurface. Those can be of biogenic origin, microbial gas that are in the green and blue areas here. And those evolve or develop because of microbial processes. They have distinct chemical signatures, and so you can source or figure out what the source of gas is based on these types of isotopic analysis.
So you said it was reported to the Illinois Emergency Management Agency?
Yes.
Is that where procedurally you're supposed to report it, or do they send it to IDNR or something after that?
I think discussion of how that was reported is ongoing as to what the specific requirements are. IEMA was the one that received the report initially.
Once IEMA gets that report, then there's kind of a group, it's kind of blasted out to other sister agencies, if you will.
And so this is in active and ongoing litigation with the Attorney General's Office, IDNR, and IEPA. So that, in a nutshell, is just what I wanted to present about natural gas storage in Illinois. I know this is very basic. I know it's broad, but I wanted to at least make the incremental step from what the introductory guide had and continue to provide a little bit more information each time. And we're happy to provide additional information as it's warranted or beneficial to the group. Yes?
The federal reg that's in place, there's a proposed final rule. What is the timeline for it to become a final rule?
Yeah, it's an interim final rule. I think it was in December of 2016 when that was put into place. And as part of it, it has a timeline for the state authorities to implement it, which I think is within 1 year of that interim final rule. And I think that's part of what the Underground Natural Gas Safety Act is intended to pull together.
And does that only apply to those interstate?
It actually applies to all oil and gas operations. So the PHMSA interim final rule would apply to intra and interstate operations.
And what are the new requirements for inspection and maintenance?
I don't believe that there are specific requirements. They're more related to well construction and the requirements of well construction. Is there?
The incorporation by reference, Senator Rose, and the task force is at American Petroleum Institute 1171. Unfortunately, it's copyrighted, but I wanted to at least review that on the, yeah, we'll have to see how we can get a copy of that, but if you look at it, it does have, it requires now public awareness. It's on the, I actually copied it. It said from review, so I didn't violate their copyright, but it's on the, so you guys would have it. It's on the, what is it? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Not the cover page, but the 5th page back at the bottom. All those things are required. So they've got public awareness, damage prevention communications, utilization of damage prevention systems, education of the public on the hazards related for unintended releases, indications of the release, procedures for reporting in the release, and actions to be taken for public safety during the release. So unfortunately, this all came into effect, guess when? December, right when they were finding the gas coming up to the surface, bubbling up in water on the land surface. So all this is in effect right now.
But
And we'll see what we can do about getting, so Mike Mankowski at DNR has been reviewing this and in comparison to what's in the Oil and Gas Act here and et cetera.
You were stating earlier the different areas that you have these agencies come and inspect the gas storages in Illinois. Did that come after or before?
That was
What
the
you-
existing.
That was the
existing structure.
So it's safe to say that wasn't good enough to find the Man Love 2 problem. But what you're
They found it, but it was already the land surface. The
Right.
federal law, none of these underground storage tanks or underground storage areas were regulated. It was only the pipelines, not the underground reservoirs. So there was really little, so DNR did some inspections, but all the detail that came out because of the issue at Alyssa Canyon, those requirements didn't apply anywhere in the United States.
Yeah, there was no ongoing annual inspection requirement as part of the existing regulatory framework. However, it is currently a goal of the IDNR office to visit all of the oil and gas wells annually. So that is,
I understand
even though
you-
it's not required, that
Right.
is their
Did I understand you to
expectation.
say that you were the ones that found the leak?
No,
No,
DNR,
okay.
their inspector,
Their
Jim
ins-
Stevens, he was out there and
I thought
it
it
was
was people's
bubbling
gas
up.
people.
I mean, there was a puddle of water and it was
Right.
bubbling up to the land surface.
Right.
And then they didn't, they sat, that was December 9th or something, and then they sampled their first well, I think, December the 20th, or something like that.
So, just in summary, this is really just intended to give you a little bit broader an understanding of natural gas storage in Illinois. We do rely significantly on natural gas and natural gas storage. There are a range of groups responsible for the regulatory oversight, and that framework is evolving because of not only leakage events within the nation, but also within the state. And I guess one point that I think is, I appreciated the conversation that you had earlier about the formation of subgroups and how that the work will actually be engaged with this body, because where to put this issue within the context of the priorities facing the Mahomet, I think, is an important discussion to have. And so the consolidated list is, I think, going to be quite useful in being able to help assign or develop that priority. I would also mention that the PRI Natural Gas Working Group and Mahomet Aquifer Response Team, formal groups set up within the Prairie Research Institute, are intending to meet later this week to talk about some of the previous recommendations from other groups and other documents, very similarly to the draft document that was put together. And we can make sure that any of those discussions are then funneled back to the agency, and then that helps inform the consolidated list to be used for prioritization. And then also, in sort of passing the baton to Jason Thomason to talk about some of the higher quality techniques of being able to do subsurface characterization, I would say in every event, whenever you have any kind of subsurface migration of fluid, it's absolutely essential to have high quality geologic information, subsurface information, to look at where the fluid is moving, what are the nature of the deposits, how are they connected. And so the information Jason will talk about is really essential in understanding fluid movement, developing leakage mitigation responses, and then also overall helping groundwater protection.
And before you go, are there any members of the public that have a question for our expert? I'm going to ask just questions, not comments, but since he's here, I want to give you that opportunity. There's public comment at the end. Come on. And Rick, can you state your name and where you're from for our minutes? I'm sorry, Steve.
I believe that might be dolomitic. Yeah. I don't think those details have been specifically identified. It was bedrock at the level where the leakage occurred, and then it did present itself within the upper zones. So, and that, this is also, I guess, another point to mention that I was going to save this in case this question did come up. We do have a special report that's coming out that specifically provides additional geologic information about the Manlove gas storage field that's here in the yellow outline, and then updated geologic cross-sections to help in the interpretation and assessment of the leakage conditions or leakage activities directly related to the Manlove, or I'm sorry, the McCord number 2 well, which is right here in the center of this cross-section, and also identified, I think right here. But this is the bedrock surface, and then this well actually extends down. This is only showing the upper 300 or so feet. That well extends an additional 3,700 feet down into the subsurface. The approximate 500-foot location would be somewhere in this area down here. So the release occurred within the bedrock.
Andrew.
I had a question. You mentioned that there is one closed field in addition to the Manlove field. Do you know, I mean, has that been, what do we know about it? Is it, it's been inspected? Is it closed out?
It's been closed. The most recent compendium of natural gas storage information from the Geological Survey is actually quite dated. It's from the 70s. But in that report from the 70s, it states that field was not active and was closed. So in 1973. I don't know if those wells are actively being inspected or what the status of those wells are, but that.
The reservoir didn't hold the gas came out of the surface.
For the Crescent City?
For the Crescent City.
So any gas that was down there now?
Yeah.
But that wouldn't have been well, it hasn't continued on for decades, and so the amount of gas, I think, would be smaller in comparison to an ongoing operation. Was that just test, though?
Yeah, it never went into production.
Yes, please. And there's a microphone right here, too, if you want to.
Thank you. Chris Storr. Randy, what sorts of downhole geophysical techniques are used to examine well integrity, both for natural gas and for oil and gas, that might have alerted the operators?
I can't really comment on what would have alerted the operators, but in general, the downhole techniques, there's a suite of downhole techniques that can be used in looking at well condition, adjacent conditions within the reservoir or within the geology, and also looking for variations in conditions. But those are all part of a standard oil and gas operation. Downhole techniques are actually one of the primary ways of looking at downhole well conditions.
They had no historical records of any downhole tests that they'd done. However, now they're going through and running mechanical integrity tests and doing vertilogs on all of their wells. But prior to that, they didn't have even a record for the McCord well.
Anyone else? Any members of the task force have any additional questions? Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks again for the opportunity to speak. My name is Jason Thomason with the State Geological Survey as well. I had the opportunity at the last meeting, the last task force meeting, to mention a publication that had come out, and I wanted to review that and give you a little bit more information about that publication. That was something that was driven by a group of us at the Geological Survey who wanted to try to create a new vision for how we were going to investigate and characterize and map aquifers in the future. We have staffing changes, expertise changes that were happening, and my colleagues and I, Kisa Mokanyamale and Steve Brown, who both are out of town today, but we came up collectively with developing a publication here to try to help communicate communicate that vision of how we were going to basically map aquifers in the future, and how to incorporate that into not only our work, but the water survey's work, incorporate it into the road cap model. We want to call it the road cap model. A lot of this was built on a workshop we ran last summer. In June, we call it the Mahomet Aquifer Workshop. We invited stakeholders, scientists from across the state. Many people, quite a few in this room, were at that workshop, where we tried to identify some of the topics that you all are working on right now. So to summarize that workshop, we came up with issues such as water quantity, recharge, water quality. Those are the stakeholder needs, the science research needs that were really addressed, and how we can use new scientific strategies, whether it's geologic mapping or groundwater modeling, to try to address those. And of course, figuring out ways to communicate those iteratively throughout the whole process. But when we were thinking about science research, we were coming up with this idea that we're roughly at an information threshold to be able to address these questions to stakeholders at any given point, for example, any given location. We want to try to get beyond the information, get beyond a level to where we can really start to address those questions quickly and more effectively. And so we've been thinking about different innovative ways to do our science research. Largely a collective strategy with both geologists and water scientists. But in this talk, I'm going to talk mainly about how we can do the geologic mapping, the framework of what we need to understand with whatever natural resource we're talking about, whether it's aggregates or groundwater or ecologies. We've got to understand the geology first. Traditionally, how we've gone about that approach, we have resources. These are very important resources: drilling, historical records, sample, laboratory analyses. We can do some spot geophysics, where we can measure different properties in the subsurface. And we've typically used that over decades and decades, and we can get a pretty nice county scale type 3D geologic framework in about 4 to 5 years. Well, we started to think, okay, we need to figure out a way to do this more effectively, more efficiently, to keep pace with those questions that stakeholders are asking and the pace at which they need answers. Through this process, in that 4 to 5 years, we can come up with a county 3D geologic model, come up with nice, beautiful cross-sections. But inherent to this, there are large areas where we don't have a lot of information, where we're using our geologic brains to fill in the gaps. So with new methods and new technology that's being developed, new expertise that people are gaining in our organization, we're looking into some airborne-based methods to study the subsurface geology. One of those particularly we call it helicopter-based transient electromagnetics. We'll call it HTEM. It's basically using a helicopter to measure electrical properties of the subsurface, and that can give us an understanding of what different layers are in the subsurface as well. We can image that. It's been used largely around the world and innovated largely by people in Denmark, geologists in Denmark. I'll get to that in a second. But not only is it new, but it's fast. You can get a lot of data, and you can go quite deep. And fast meaning it used to take us 4 to 5 years to do a county. If we can implement this at kind of a county scale, we can start to gather the same data in a matter of months or weeks, potentially. So we're excited about trying to implement this, and we have started to in the region, in Illinois, for example. I'll talk about that in a second. Just to briefly summarize what it is, we have a helicopter that's towing a device that emits an electrical and EM signal, and it has a receiver as well. That electromagnetic field penetrates the subsurface, and we're trying to figure out the maze of what's going on down here. And so that maze affects that magnetic field, and we can measure how it affects that magnetic field and then create an image of what's in the subsurface. Again, as I mentioned before, we can get deep, high resolution or a lot of data at a particular scale. It's fast and relatively cost effective. I'll get into costs in a few more slides.
How long have you been doing this, or how long has it been adopted, I guess?
The technology has been around for decades, but we're starting to implement it just in the last year. We have scientists who are working with people from Denmark, working with people from Canada, who are, and the USGS, for example, who have been doing this for quite a while. So the setup is simply a helicopter. It's towing this device below it. This is a picture of it in action here. This is actually from Denmark, apparently. And again, just to reiterate, we have a geologic framework, a maze that we don't quite understand. We still get lots of good, great data from boreholes and from other geophysical ground-based methods, but we have a lot of gaps that we want to fill in. And this is one way that we can start to fill in the gaps and try to use these data to supplement those critical other ground-based borehole data. We still need some of those data, but this is the way to fill in the gaps between them. This is an example from the Denmark studies, where they've flown almost the whole country of Denmark. The country of Denmark is only about the size of a third of Illinois. But this is an example of geologic mapping, where the colors are representing different geologic features. And so someone used boreholes, all these little dots, to map these geologic features. Well, then they came back and used HTEM, helicopter-based. We start to see how the resolution of those features changes to become more improved, and we start to see new features show up that weren't in our original interpretation. So the spatial coverage of data is much greater, much quicker, and helps us improve our geologic knowledge of these obscure things that are hundreds of feet below our feet, and certainly obscure things such as aquifers, which we're trying to understand a little bit better. This is an example of a slice, a cross-section of those data, where the different colors mean different geologic materials. For example, the oranges and the reds are likely sand and gravel type coarser grain materials. The blues are what they are calling clays. So that's kind of the resolution that can be extracted over the course of a few kilometers, up to, I guess this is about a 20-kilometer swath with a helicopter. They've also done this in Nebraska. The USGS has been running this, and just in the past couple of years, mapping aquifers out at, I can't remember which river valley out there, but they're mapping shallow sand and gravel aquifers out in the Nebraska area. Might be just the Platte River. Just to get back to the Denmark example, which is a pretty cool example, to think about the speed and the cost associated with this. This was a study area that they had about 20 kilometers by 20 kilometers. They flew this entire area over 1,000 miles of linear flight lines, spaced about 100 meters or 50 meters apart in 1 week. If we were to do that with ground-based electrical methods, which we can get the same data with ground-based, it would take us roughly 1,118 days to get the same data. When they got the same, it takes us about a mile a day. Yeah, we can get about a mile a day of the same data with ground-based. So in general, there are some mobilization costs and data collection costs, roughly around $100 per mile. That changes depending on the size of the project. So the total cost for this project ended up being around $216,000. We have actually had our pilot study in Illinois, where Kisa Mokanyamale, my colleague, led this project off the coast of the Chicago area and Lake County, where they're measuring sand deposition and sand deposits and the sand thickness right on the shore because of infrastructure development, and the sand is eroding away, and they're trying to understand processes associated with that. They ran last fall 640 line miles off the coast, it took about 3 days. again, it would take about 640 days for us to do that with ground-based. And again, the costs associated with mobilization and the line miles and processing turned out to be a little less than $200,000 for that. So we're talking tens of square miles kind of projects that we have right now as far as, cost-benefit, cost area type projects. This is a figure from that circular, that publication I mentioned, just giving us a relative understanding of costs. Of course, every single time there's a project, there's a startup cost. Depending on the scale of that project, we can have cost savings. It just depends on how many times the helicopter has to fly from Canada and come down and start the project. Also, the larger the project area or the more linear miles that the project can fly, the lower that rate per mile goes down. The more that rate per mile goes down. So from 100, it may decrease to 90, 80, something like that. So anyway, on the order of tens to 100 square miles or so, we're talking a couple $100,000 roughly per project. We start to think about the scale of the Mahomet, which is kind of the scale at which the Danes had flown. They fly their whole country. It's kind of about the same, about a third of our state. We have to think about in different terms of cost and benefit. So we've come up with just a schematic here of, okay, if we were to break this Mahomet Aquifer region up into different regions, what are the costs associated with those potentially? Looking at the square mileage, the flight line lengths at certain intervals, and total costs. And so breaking this up into different regions, we're talking upwards of hundreds of thousands of dollars to the low millions of dollars, depending on how much we want to investigate across the region. So that's just trying to get you, get us an idea of, and help us understand the idea of how to price the scaling of the project. And so just to summarize, we're really excited about trying to implement this as our vision of how we're going to study aquifers in the future and map them, not to replace what we already do, but to really increase our knowledge base and increase the speed at which we can do it. So with HCM, it's rapid, it's high density. We immediately start to see things we've never seen before. We do have limitations with certain logistical aspects of a project. The FAA doesn't allow that helicopter to fly over any human being. So they assume that any building, any car or interstate may have a human on it. So those are some limitations that can be worked around. We certainly can't fly over a big city center with lots of electrical power. So those are things to address. But again, we want to use this technology to move into across a threshold of information, integrate that into the RoadCap model at whatever level we can do that. And then, of course, try to then help stakeholders with the confidence of their decision making. I mean, that's the ultimate goal. So that's a breakdown of our vision. And here are the people associated with that vision, as well as people from the water survey as well. Sure.
Do you have a feel yet, using this, what type of new characteristics you might learn about the Mahomet Aquifer and other aquifers, or is you not into it enough that you can comment on that?
Sure. Based on the other studies we've seen with Denmark and USGS, we're trying to pick out and basically fill in those gaps of information that we don't have already. And at the resolution of this type of investigation, you can start to see the larger patterns of square miles of area that we have no data, and start to see, for example, boundaries of the Mahomet Aquifer example. That boundary is something we interpret. We can take measurements with this that can help us really isolate that boundary of where we think and know the aquifer is. But it can also tell us a little bit about what it's like. Is it sandier over here? Is it clayier over here? What types of, how does it change throughout its spatial extent? which are things that still we have to interpret at this point. If we can actually measure it, it would be better to do it that way, or more efficient, I suppose.
Any other questions, Diane?
So for no more than $10 million, we could map the entire aquifer and fill in the missing information.
That's our guess. That's our estimate, yeah.
How long would that take? Under ideal circumstances, if we could do it all in one fell swoop?
Yeah, that's a good question. With logistically, seasonally, with the resources, to actually gather the data, I would estimate months to a year, I would say. As far as processing all that data and getting geologists involved, I'd say another months to a year, I'd say. I don't know. The whole aquifer. That's kind of what I was thinking about as far as that timeline goes. That's a lot of information. But if we have resources to accommodate it, we could do it more quickly. Let's get 5 helicopters out there. That'd be great.
Have you prioritized, like you had those 7 regions broken out? Were those by priority at all, or are they just 7 regions you looked at?
Just
How you split it up?
7 arbitrary reasons.
Are there other ways you could split it up in terms of getting, effective data, like the stuff we need most first,
Sure.
like focusing on, for example,
Sure.
the area, well, people's gas is deeper than you can scan, but.
Sure. And that's, yeah, and I would say that's the iterative process between stakeholders and scientists on figuring out where those areas are. As a scientist, we have scientific issues and questions that we'd like to explore, but are they going to benefit stakeholders? Boundaries are, the Mahomet Aquifer boundary is potentially one of those. Thickness, character of different areas is another one, certainly.
Claudia?
Alex?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, your last bullet, to me, just the whole thing. Groups like us, we're gonna wrestle with what can or can't you do in any given location, relative to the existence of the aquifer. Which is
Sure.
obviously not apparent standing on the ground. You can't stand there and say, I'm in a cornfield, here's the line, on this
Sure.
side of this line, I can do this. On that side of the line, I can't, because, whoever decided that was the best policy for the state. But without that fundamental understanding and the ability to go out and tell a property owner, this is what's happening here, with enough degree of confidence that, it has legal and economic ramifications that are significant, you have to have a pretty high degree of comfortability that you really do understand what's going on down there. So this is really fundamental, at least in my understanding of what we're doing. The same kind of concept applies when we talk about recharge areas. You have to know where is this recharge happening. You can't just say, well, you can do this over here, so from now on, you can't do this over here. You'd like to know with some degree of confidence that that's actually going on before we start telling people they can't do that on the property.
And it's certainly going to be difficult to get a geologist to draw a line and say, I'm 100% confident. But again, like you said, it's a great tool to help with that. And certainly this type of technology is not going to pick out a sandbox in somebody's backyard. It's more, it's not that kind of scale. That's why we have ground-based stuff. But at any rate, it's meant more towards fast, efficient.
And we need to understand what we do and don't know.
Sure.
Before we can really have a conversation.
That's a good point.
A question over here.
You said you're not allowed to fly it over human beings.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, what would happen to human beings? And then the other thing is, I'm sort of curious about, how do you figure out the areas where you could fly it without putting anybody, I just have no sense of, the Mahomet Aquifer as we know it now.
Sure.
The areas that are, devoid of human beings.
Yeah.
I'm just going to remind everybody, if you're speaking, please turn on your mic, because otherwise our tape recording isn't going to work. You want to
I think I can repeat it. So there were 2 questions. What is the impact to human beings individually of this, since we can't fly over human beings? And 2, how do we
figure out where there are not human beings?
Yeah, okay. How do we figure out how do we find areas to fly over? From my understanding, it's simply more of it's just like the electrical signal from power lines. It's not going to impact individuals just by flying over them. The risk is dropping that thing on an individual or a building. And that's just an FAA regulation, apparently. Secondly, if I use this example, this is in Denmark, again, a 20-kilometer by 20-kilometer area. There are roads and interstates all over through here. So they're not the United States, but from our understanding with the vendor, we figure out different flight lines before the flights ever happen on where they can go and where they can't go. And typically, they can go everywhere that there aren't buildings, and they can fly over some roads but not interstates, and some interstates but not other roads. But they fly low enough to where they have to come up and over your basic power line. So it is a low flight path, and those power lines cause disturbance, and they have to then pull that out of the data when it's all done. So it is certainly feasible with a lot of planning, yeah.
Anyone else? Come on up.
Jason, Steve Carter, just from a layman's perspective, there are a couple of big questions that I think we can't answer right now for certain. And one is, where are the recharge areas for the aquifer? And secondly, is there any way of using this technology to identify pathways from either retired or active landfills into the aquifer?
With any of those types of questions, I think it gets down to our main goal is trying to understand the geologic framework and as much data and information and detail as we can understand about it. And this is one tool to do that. So trying to address recharge areas, we work with hydrogeologists and we work with other scientists to try to understand and share as much of this information as we can to identify what is a recharge area. But again, it's the detail that, as a geologist, is trying to understand the detail of the geology to really discretize those areas, as well as issues about landfills as well, and landfill contamination potential. Sure.
My name is Steve Bridges. I'm a private citizen from DeWitt County. And it looks like for this technology to work, you said it has to fly below the level of power lines, so it has to go up over power lines. How would this technique be affected by a wind farm?
A wind farm?
Yeah, because DeWitt County is being proposed for a massive wind farm, and I'm guessing the turbines are taller than the power lines, so I'm guessing that technology doesn't work real well with a wind farm.
That's a great question. I've never been asked that.
Because if we're going to do this, it seems like there's a timing issue that
Sure.
maybe you want to get in there before they build a wind farm, or maybe you want to have a moratorium on wind farm until this is completed, or?
Yeah, I'm not sure about regulations of flying through wind farms. The question was, how would wind farms impact the logistics of using the technology? Our geophysicist, Kisa, may have a better idea on that. She's worked in Chicago on this. She's worked with the people from Denmark a lot. One of the issues I can see is electrical infrastructure between those could cause disturbance.
George is trying to help you.
It would violate all the minimums.
It does? Well, that could be a problem then, yeah. Yep.
Are there any notes on accuracy? Do you have comparisons to the air, and then you've done the ground samples at the same place? Are they fairly similar?
The Denmark folks have done that quite a bit. We have done in Lake Michigan, we had airborne, and then we had waterborne, and they overlapped a little bit and looked very similar. They had different resolutions. So the ground base is going to be higher resolution, have quite a bit more variability, but overall, say for example, in Lake Michigan, the sand thickness that we saw in waterborne was very similar to what we interpret as the sand thickness with airborne. So it's exactly the same technology, the same physics. It's just two different techniques of doing it.
this may be a little bit ahead of where we are, but would this data be publicly available?
After it's flown?
After you've processed it, and like the LiDAR data, which is the elevation data online, is great. It's a good resource, and I would wonder if this would be something that.
Others may be able to help me. I think typically, yes. I mean, it depends on the funding agents, on that agreement, but we anticipate that, yes, it would be publicly available. It certainly reports that come out of it become publicly available.
What was the price tag again?
Depends on what you want to do.
I heard the mayor say 10 million, Mayor Marlin, but
Yeah, we've estimated between 10 and 12 million for the entire, to fly the whole Aquifer. And that, is, again, is a ballpark first estimate based on some of the smaller projects that we've already done and communication with the vendor as well. All right.
Do you have something? No?
I just want to, I'm also a hydrogeologist, so there seems to be a critical mass of hydrogeologists in the room, but very interesting topic. And I do appreciate the presentation, and I also want to make sure that it's also known that this is really kind of a transformational technology that would fundamentally change the understanding of the Mahomet Aquifer. It's not just figuring out where a line is one way or the other. It fundamentally changes our understanding of how things happen in the subsurface and the physical occurrence of where these things are. So it really could be an essential assessment to better understanding all of the Mahomet
I would, yeah, that's very well put. Thanks, Randy.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
All right, so the next item on our agenda relates to future meetings. We have a meeting for April 30th, May 14th, and June 18th already scheduled. Do we have any volunteers as far as hosts for an April meeting? Do we want to move to another area of the aquifer? And I think, yep.
I would volunteer Normal as a location.
Okay. We will work with you. And we talked about going west during planting season, so be thinking about places for May. May or June, whichever, right? And the 10 to 12 time frame for everybody still works.
One thing I might say, the May to June period, June could probably catch, you can see planting more, you can see water irrigation more. That might be a little more June contract there.
In June? Okay, so we'll head west in June.
Now, I said that, it'll probably be raining.
Sure.
You can't predict.
Any public participation, any member of the public have anything that they'd wish to add, please step forward to this microphone, state your name.
Hi, my name's Steve Bridges, and like I say, I'm a private citizen from DeWitt County. I just want to thank you all for taking the time out of your busy schedules, because time is a valuable resource, and this should be a no-brainer, protecting people's drinking water. But as witnessed by all the people here at the table, there's a lot of interest in water, whether it's personal, industrial. We need water for agriculture. And honestly, we have some people that want us to take a risk in order for their industry to work. And so, you've got a big task ahead of you, and won't be easy. But I want to thank you for taking the time. I would like to ask that as you go through these, that since we have the agency at the table, and I thank them for being a part of it, if perhaps it's not a good time to also review some of the agency's procedures, because quite frankly, to a lot of us, that's an unknown. We don't know what they go through in their permitting decisions, in their enforcement decisions, and quite frankly, they are our first line of defense for our water. And I think we have to be honest that if it wasn't for some decisions made back in 2010, we probably all wouldn't be here today. But I think it's good that we are here today. So perhaps if that can be part of the review process, and perhaps if we have a better understanding what you all have to go through and the pressures you are put on you, because we know that you have to juggle a lot of things, and it's not an easy job. And perhaps if we better understood that, we would have a better understanding of all the forces and pressures being put upon you. So, perhaps if that can be part of the conversation, and out of that, perhaps maybe some suggestions about maybe some changes that can be made, maybe changes that you've been wanting to make, but perhaps that you haven't been able to communicate to the representatives and to the public. So, that would just be my one ask is if perhaps during the process that could be a part of this, and perhaps we can get a better understanding with the agency and help them out if they need the help. I know funding is an issue, and they can only do so much with the funding they have, and quite frankly, they could probably do more if they had more funding. So, you can't get blood out of a turnip. So, so perhaps that's also something we can think about. So that was just my one comment, that I just wanted to thank you all, and I wish you the best luck, because this is incredibly important to the people of Illinois. So thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else? Any other task force comments? If anybody has items they'd like to see included on our next agenda, please get in touch with me so we can make sure that those get incorporated. And we will do the same thing again, where we'll send out a draft and people can comment. We need a motion to adjourn. Do we have a second? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Opposed, same sign. We are adjourned.